Again, my name is Jim Kleinidler. I'm a fellow in regulatory affairs at Boston Scientific. I've been at the company for about 7 or 8 years now, and prior to that, I was a reviewer out in DC at FDA in their division of cardiovascular devices. My background is in chemical engineering, and I have a doctorate in toxicology, researching cardiovascular combination products. So I'm really excited for Chris's presentation here following this. I wanted to just say I'm thrilled to be here and share with you some thoughts around what our company is doing to improve our process of how we prioritize early stage technologies to ones we're going to take forward through the lens of regulatory, through the lens of clinical, through the lens of reimbursement. I'd also like to share some thoughts about what FDA is doing with their programs and their mechanisms that they have to streamline and help sponsors de-risk their paths to market. So we'll have some time for questions following the session here. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'll be focusing on sort of the upstream development process. So every company's product life cycle has a different kind of flavor to it, but at our company, this encompasses the exploratory and technology development phase of our life cycle. I think this is a really interesting area to explore, particularly when you're talking about how to stratify what you're taking forward into development. Because as you get further in this process, the costs go up, and sort of the sunk costs go up, right? And it's harder and harder to maybe pivot to a different direction. In this early stage, you have increased uncertainty on the regulatory front, on the technological front. There's been a lot of changes in the U.S. regulatory framework with the FDA restructuring this year that's more blending the lines between post-market and pre-market. And they're using a lot more post-market data to inform pre-market review. They're also releasing guidances at record speed, and trying to modernize how they're assessing data for these new platform devices. On the European front, we have the new medical device regulations, which have been under negotiation for the last 8 years or so, which has introduced increased scrutiny on the market surveillance side, but also increased requirements for clinical evidence for Class 3 and implants. So I'll be focusing on 3 topics today. One, the first is kind of beginning at the beginning, how we improve our investment decisions in pipeline technology. 2 is once you've gotten that putative strategy, you're going to likely be talking with regulators. So how do you go about that through pre-submission meetings? I'll give some practical tips on how to do that. And then the third bucket is how to use these various FDA programs that they offer for innovative technologies to streamline the path to market. And again, I'll give some tips on how to use those. So I wanted to start this section with a quote from Ed Mackey, who's our EVP of operations at Boston Scientific. And he was presenting at an awards banquet a couple years ago now and said, our pipeline is bursting, but we simply can't fund everything. And this is leading to some really hard decisions. And I like this because 2 reasons. One, it highlights the importance of a well-informed process to prioritize early stage technologies, but it also acknowledges that it's not easy. And so the question becomes, how do we make it easier to stratify technologies by strategic fit or risk or investment? And I think the answer to that is a well-informed business case. Now, not everything is going to make it to the finish line. Not everything is going to make it to patients, but the benefits of focusing our resources and our funds, our people on technologies that have the best chance of making it to patients are pretty clear. Patients have better options. It energizes the workforce. People enjoy working on things that are kind of progressing through the process. and then it grows your business and it satisfies the financial community. Now, over the last few years, I've had many interviews with VPs, directors, senior managers across R&D, across process development, across business development, trying to understand where the gaps are, where the bottlenecks are, like how do we optimize our process of prioritizing these pipeline candidates. And two things have come out of those interviews. One is that an early understanding of risk improves the process of selecting devices to take forward. Now, it's not entirely novel. This could be, it's not only commercial risk, but maybe market risk or technical risk. But the second thing was that many development teams struggle to find the cross-functional partners that support project momentum. And so this is the case where an R&D or a PD team comes together and they have a concept and they seek out that feedback from SMEs across regulatory or clinical, maybe, but due to priority calls or bandwidth concerns or, conflicts in that, they're not able to get that feedback in a timely manner to get them through the next governance milestone or, the next funding milestone. And so the project kind of languishes. So the thesis that a few of us have been focused on over the last few years is that early cross-functional input to business cases can improve investment outcomes in new growth areas. And we've been developing structures and processes that encourage more of a formal sort of internal consulting process for exploratory technologies. So that you don't have the gaps and sort of the loss in momentum of some of our most innovative programs. So at the company, I lead what we call the Emerging Therapies team. It's a team of about 15 folks across these different work streams. We have clinical reg and HEMA is health economics and market access. That's our reimbursement group. And our charter is really to advise exploratory teams, early stage teams on things like study design, controls, clinical costs, where might you run the studies, things around regulatory, competitive intel, helping with classification decisions and predicate strategy and giving thoughts on indications and how, what claims you might be wanting to make and how to get there. And then on the reimbursement side, we commonly advise on things like analogs for payment, how FDA and CMS looks at evidence, and then optimizing studies for coverage. And while these are sort of on the screen here, separate swim lanes, there's very much a Venn diagram sort of relationship between these, in that the evidence that it takes to maybe satisfy one stakeholder also is important for another stakeholder. And so one of the benefits of sort of structuring a team this way and putting together a model this way is that it takes advantage of the shared needs across the different stakeholders that you're trying to satisfy for a successful commercialization. So that's what we're doing. We've started this about 5 years ago, and this team has consulted for nearly 100 different exploratory type projects during that time. And these are like 1 month deep dives on putting guardrails around what these teams can expect from a regulatory, clinical, or reimbursement perspective. So, I'm excited to see where it goes. And I think the model is one that we're seeing, quite a fair adoption of. So once you have that putative strategy, once you have sort of internal alignment on what the design might look like, what claims you want to make, it's time to communicate with regulators to align on strategy, align on expectations, requirements, and in that way, you're better informing how much ultimately the project is going to cost, but also what's your return on investment timeline look like. And so communicating with the regulators early is a way to increase the confidence in the early assumptions that have been made through the early diligence process. And I'll take a step back. So the Presub process, also called the QSub program, is the pre-submission process that, it's the mechanism by which companies engage FDA in conversations. That's one of the programs that has sort of a positive impact on early decision making. A couple of the others that I'll cover are Early Feasibility Study Program, the Breakthrough Device Designation, and Safer Technologies Program. But we'll start with the QSub program. So I think this is really, I can't stress, I guess, the importance of talking with FDA early enough. There was a paper published a few years ago by Ariel Stern and others at Harvard Business that conducted an analysis over the last 10 years, including Class 3 products that have been approved through FDA. And what they found was that sponsors of Class 3 medical devices spend about 34% longer in the approval process versus follow-on entrants if they're the first in a product code. So the way it works is that if your device is significantly different in terms of, say, technology or indications compared with the closest analogous device that's currently approved, FDA will assign a new product code, which is kind of a subgroup within the regulation that covers that particular functionality or claim. And if you're first in that product code, you can expect to spend about 7 months longer in the approval process as compared to a company or a device that comes in as second to that product code or third or fourth. And in this publication, there were a couple of contributors that were identified as contributing to the longer review cycle for these pioneers. The first is technological uncertainty. So this is high when regulators just haven't seen anything that functions like your device or has claims like your device before. And so there's some learning curve there. The other type of uncertainty that contributes to a first mover disadvantage is content and format uncertainty. And this arises where the agency might be familiar with the technology, but they're just not sure how the qualification data that you're submitting, how they're going to use that for regulatory decision making. So maybe it's new testing or new endpoints or sort of methods that they're not, familiar with. That can lead also to a disadvantage for the pioneers. So this evaluation criteria hasn't been formally articulated through like guidance documents or informally through established precedent of other similar devices. And so this highlights the importance of educating regulators through informational meetings, show and tell, aligning with them, not only on how the device works, but how the data that you're going to be submitting will be evaluated and what their expectations are. So there's several different ways of engaging the agency to mitigate uncertainty in your regulatory process, increase predictability, and increase confidence in some of your assumptions. First, before contacting FDA, read what you consider to be the most applicable guidance documents for your product. Number two, if you're seeking general feedback around how a process works, for example, or timing, or what are the commitments for FDA to get back to us and how many days, or just sort of more of the mechanics of the regulatory process. There's the Division of Industry and Consumer Education, DICE, and they're really responsive, and I'd highly recommend using them for just broad questions. Really, really great. We probably engage them, weekly on stuff. For more directional feedback, you can contact the assistant director of the relevant review division. And all of that information is on FDA's website as far as who the leadership is and their email addresses. And then for more specific feedback, engage the FDA review team through pre-submission meetings. And this is when you want more technical feedback on, alignment on a specific test method or clinical trial design or animal study. Now, the pre-submission process isn't only helpful for sponsors. for the companies to get alignment on these strategies, but it's also useful for regulators because they're gauging through this interaction what they can expect from the sponsor. You know, they're wondering, am I going to be getting the real chicken with this sponsor? Or, you know, do we feel that they're pulling the wool over our eyes? They're not being transparent. They're, you know, there might be some issues there with openness and how much they're willing to share. And so if you're open, authentic, you know, it helps sort of the engagement and just being transparent about what your plans are and what you have seen. And if there's problems that you've come across, sort of discussing that openly can go a long way in driving efficiency into the process, because FDA isn't starting from a place of we need to really go to ground on each piece of data that this company submits, right? Because that can slow everything down. And I apologize, this came out kind of small. So a couple tips to optimize these FDA interactions is, first, establish a key objective for each meeting. So we, at our company, will usually go in for an informational meeting to just establish some rapport with the review team, kind of a meet and greet and an introduction to what the technology is. We'll go in for a second pre-submission on the non-clinical aspects, maybe the critical path items from bench testing, or we'll align on biocompatibility or animal testing. And then the last pre-sub will typically be on trial design and what the sample size is and, you know, endpoints and all of that. Request the assistant director, lead reviewer, and any specific FDA subject matter experts. If you're submitting things like computational modeling, you're going to want to make sure somebody that's familiar with computational modeling is there to give you some substantive feedback on that. Follow and include the QSub acceptance checklist. So there's an acceptance checklist which goes through all the elements that should be present in a request for a pre-submission meeting. And I recommend actually checking those and indicating on that checklist where within your package that information is found, because it just helps them, you know, traceability wise to find where all the elements are. And it can speed up the acceptance review of your file. In-person meetings are best for complex and early stage meetings. So some of the first interactions, we prefer to have in-person meetings. With, you know, COVID and how that resolves, in-person meeting may be available again in the near future, but at the present time, everything is telecon. Wisely use time management. We typically will reserve 30 minutes for the more didactic, like presentation part of the meeting, and then 30 minutes strictly for discussion on the topics. We're not regurgitating every single thing that was present in the request for the pre-submission. We're not going to ground on the disease state because FDA already knows that, or, you know, necessarily how the device works. And so I've just seen a lot of companies burn through their time and then they leave 5 minutes at the end for discussion, and it's, you know, it's not as valuable from a takeaway perspective. Include a summary of pre-subs and subsequent pre-market applications. So if you're submitting a marketing application, you know, after a series of pre-submission discussions, include the minutes from all those discussions in the marketing application itself and how you resolved any outstanding issues or contentious, you know, points. Because they can just see that you've closed the loop on all of that, and it can be helpful. And then be mindful of hints regarding what you're not asking. So it can be attractive to go into a pre-submission meeting, and if FDA didn't push back on something that you didn't mention explicitly, then you maybe kind of take it as a tacit acceptance of FDA on that position or on that, you know, that issue. When in reality, maybe their mind was somewhere else, and it just, you know, we ran out of time in the meeting, or, you know, so it's always better to sort of, again, be upfront with the issues that you view are the most contentious, or you have the most strategic question about and are most impactful to your timelines and the cost of the project. Okay, so I'll cover next some of the other FDA programs that they offer to streamline path to market. There's the Early Feasibility Study program, which I'll cover next. And a lot of you might be familiar with this already. It's been around since 2013, and it's essentially a scaled clinical trial. So it represents often what a company's first clinical experience in the United States is going to be with a novel device. It's typically less than 15 patients, and it's really intended to address fundamental questions about device performance and device safety. So it's not intended to support on its own a marketing application. It's more intended to, if you have a device and you just have questions you can't answer on the bench or in animal models, you need to move to humans. The early feasibility study is a way to do that, and they're very flexible in terms of, how you can iterate a device during that study, and how you can actually expand that study so that it's more seamless transition between an early feasibility study and a pivotal trial. Your traditional feasibility study is it's a larger study, maybe 30 to 50 patients. Usually those sorts of studies are used to inform assumptions that go into a pivotal trial. So things around event rates, for example, that go into powering a study. And then the pivotal trial is more of your randomized control trial, statistically based sample sizes and powered endpoints. And those studies are the ones that are intended for safety, to support safety and effectiveness going into your marketing application. Key elements of this program that allow it to be a bit more efficient in startup are that FDA is promoting this idea of the right testing at the right time, such that some testing, if it's chronic testing, they might accept shorter durations for longer term testing, or maybe smaller sample sizes, or they'll say, certain tests can be deferred to the pivotal IDE or the marketing application. They're also more willing to leverage testing from other devices or from, previous iterations of the device to support initiation of an early feasibility study. Unknowns and risk are addressed through a more robust risk assessment as compared to what's typically provided in more traditional feasibility or pivotal IDEs. And then FDA offers timely device and clinical protocol changes. So they offer this 5-day notification for protocol amendments to get those changes out to sites. They also offer contingent approval for changes. So if you learn something in the first 2 or 3 patients and you want to make a design update, you can provide FDA with an overview of what that change is, provide them with a plan for how you're going to assess the impact of that change. And then if they agree with that plan, you can go ahead, run those tests, make that change, and roll out that change to the sites without any additional pre-approval or pre-review of that data. So some of the tips for EFS clinical trials are that patient safety is number one. FDA recommends, especially for new devices where you might have an unfamiliar delivery system or approach to delivering the device, have a bailout plan in place. As I mentioned, there's this concept of learn as you go. So you're not encouraged to schedule consecutive cases close together. More often, it's recommended to schedule a case or 2 cases and then learn from the technical success of those cases, maybe the acute safety data from those cases before enrolling the next sort of set or next cohort of patients. It's normal to have this frequent stop and go and deep dive into each case as you learn. Keep FDA in the loop, the good, the bad, or ugly. And then if EFS results are promising, so if you get to that end of the 15 patients, and everything looks good, have discussions with them about what that transition looks like to a pivotal IDE. Have that discussion early about what evidence they're going to need to support enrolling additional patients, because sometimes that might include a chronic animal state study or more longer term kind of critical path durability testing on the bench or something. And to get that started early can be an advantage to transition into your pivotal. Okay, so breakthrough device designation is another program that's gotten a lot of visibility over the last couple of years. It is a program that FDA offers to provide more timely patient access by expediting development, assessment, and review of devices. I'll get to the acceptance criteria here on the next slide, but a couple of the advantages if you're accepted, if your device is designated as breakthrough, are that you're able to work with FDA through what's called a data development plan, which is you map out basically all of the evidence that's going to be necessary to support commercialization of the device through maybe early feasibility studies to pivotal trials and even what post-market activities might be warranted. So it gets kind of everybody on the same page and it's more efficient in that way. Sprint discussions, so they've committed to 45-day review period for pre-submission sort of discussions under the breakthrough framework. This differs from traditional pre-submissions that have a 75-day turnaround. So you're able to get more rapid agreement on development issues. And then clinical protocol agreement. This is a binding agreement on study protocol and design of the study. All of the pre-submission meetings are non-binding. Typically, they try to keep to those minutes and those discussions and commitments, but this is an additional advantage of being under the breakthrough framework. To be designated as breakthrough, your device has to show a more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about what that means on the next slide. That's the first criteria. The second criteria is that you can meet one of the following: that you justify why the technology is novel, that it's not U.S. approved or cleared, or that there's no alternative U.S. approved or cleared device. C is that there's a significant advantage over available U.S. devices, and that lastly, the availability of your device is in the best interest of the patient. And they've designated, I want to say, several hundred, like 4 or 5, on the order of 400 or 500 breakthrough designations to date. So there's a lot of activity here. A couple of takeaways or tips for drafting a breakthrough application are outlined on this slide. One is align with FDA on the standard of care. So that first criteria about more effectively treating or diagnosing a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease, it really hinges on your ability to compare your device and the anticipated advantages over what the standard of care is in the United States for that condition. And if there's not equipoise, and oftentimes for diseases that have poor outcomes, there's a lot of different things that people are trying, and the standard of care may not be very clear. Maybe there's not clear guidelines. So it can be extremely helpful to align with the agency on what they consider standard of care is, so that your application is addressing sort of their expectation of that comparison. Number 2 is focus the message. I think when we're developing something innovative, we have a laundry list of things that it could do that we think are maybe anticipated advantages. I would say focus that application on really the advantages that are supported by evidence, most strongly supported by evidence, and focus that, control the narrative to those couple specific benefits. Include a robust risk analysis that addresses safety. Safety isn't really called out as much in the breakthrough application as is effectiveness, but FDA also considers safety in these designations. Provide test reports for unique assessments, things like computational modeling or unique animal study designs. It can be helpful to include some additional detail, supportive information around why those are supportive of your conclusions. And then include doctor and patient perspectives. So I've seen quite a few applications that include testimonials, both from physicians and from patients, and that can help in FDA's decision-making, especially around that criteria where they're trying to assess whether it's in the best interest of the patient. Patient perspective has been a regulatory science priority for FDA over the last 5 years, probably, or longer. So I think it's timely to include, that sort of information in the application. And then lastly, broaden the internal review of the application, get a less familiar perspective from coworkers on, is the story straightforward? Is it focused? Are we walking away from the application with the right message? Okay, and then lastly, I'll cover the Safer Technologies Program STEP. And this has just gone into effect March of this year. It is a program that's designed similarly to FDA's Breakthrough Device Program, but it's for devices that target a disease less serious than those eligible for the Breakthrough Program. And it's intended for devices that improve the benefit-risk profile of treatment or diagnostics through substantial safety innovations. So in practice, what this means is that if a device isn't eligible for breakthrough because FDA doesn't agree that it's addressing a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition, then they might suggest that you go, the STEP program way instead. And it's offering very similar principles in terms of expedited sort of device development plan and prioritized review. It's giving you a more rapid opportunity for interaction with a more of a 45-day sort of pre-submission timeline. And then they also comment on the opportunity for senior management level involvement in the review process, which can be helpful to just drive consistency across decision making at the agency. So this is the designation criteria for STEP. As I mentioned, it should not be eligible for breakthrough due to the less serious nature of the disease or condition targeted. And number two is that it should offer a substantial safety innovation with respect to reducing serious adverse events, device failure modes, use-related hazards or use error, or an improvement in the safety of another device or intervention. So if it's used, for example, as an accessory to something else, that might be eligible for the STEP program. So here's some resources, just different mailboxes that you can, again, engage FDA through on the breakthrough device pathway or the Safer Technologies Program. There's a couple of the guidances listed there for both of those programs, as well as the Early Feasibility Study Program. So I'll stop there, and I welcome any questions. Thank you so much. Okay.
So I have a device that I'm working on right now that we've been using for compassionate use trials over in the EU. We have about 6 trials under our belt right now, really promising. Is that? Yep. So is that something that could potentially feed into either the STEP or the I've already forgot the acronym for the other one?
The Breakthrough Program?
The Breakthrough Program,
yeah.
correct.
Yeah, so I think any clinical experience, even under compassionate use or emergency use framework, can be useful to support um, your claims around anticipated benefit, assuming that some benefit was achieved in those patients. Typically, emergency use or compassionate use doesn't have sort of the traditional like endpoints and protocol-driven sort of design, right? And so the follow-up may be captured less stringently, but I mean, it's far better to have some clinical evidence than going in with no clinical evidence. And we're seeing trends over the last year, 18 months, where FDA has really, they've encouraged clinical data to the point where it's almost like a prerequisite. It's not, called out in the guidance as a requirement, but practically, that's almost what the expectation is these days.
Right. So this particular is a drug combo product, and it's a novel delivery system and a novel distribution of the drug. So we're kind of feeling our way in the dark here because we have no idea how this is going to actually come to market with the FDA. So this is actually really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, yeah, in the back. Yep.
So I'm curious because you've been on both sides of the table and you've talked a lot about kind of, don't assume one thing about what somebody's thinking on the other side. They may just not be thinking of it. But could you maybe give us a little insight into sort of the emotional component of it? I mean, if you're sitting down with somebody from the FDA, they're human beings. They may have had a crisis at home this morning or whatever. How do you think about the mindset they're in, and how do you sort of open that and match that when you sit down actually at the table with somebody?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that it's really important to lay the foundation for what the need is for this technology. I think the agency can be more, I think they're compelled to be more flexible or open to alternative approaches to support safety and effectiveness decisions. If they really understand what the need is and what the outcomes of patients are that are receiving standard of care today, and I don't think that, I mean, the reviewers typically have an understanding of the disease state, right? Like what the etiology of the disease is, what the patient population is, but I think really highlighting the fact that existing therapies are deficient in this way. And this is why this technology offers some reprieve for patients. And if you have a patient perspective as well, from talking with, maybe it's through a physician that you're working with, but reading out on that and sharing that during the pre-sub meetings is powerful. And I think I still recall some of those where, there's a company that comes in with a clinical consultant that maybe practices, and they've done some procedures with the device OUS, in Europe or somewhere else, and they can share what the sort of the patient experience was, and it's impactful.
Would it be a bridge too far to actually bring a patient?
Say that again? Would
it be a bridge too far to bring a patient with you to the first meeting?
Oh, I haven't seen that before. Yeah, I don't see why not. I just don't know. That hasn't been a strategy that I've seen, and we haven't employed that before. But I don't see why you couldn't do that. Yeah.
My question is, a lot of startup companies, they tend to do non-GLP study because GLP study is more expensive. That's the first part. And based on the FDA regulation, it says GLP study. And how would FDA accept non-GLP study? And then followed by that, those companies, startup companies, in order to reduce the cost, try to do the first in human or feasibility study in outside of the United States, somewhere cheaper. And how would FDA accept that? And then in case of, the third part is, in case of the adverse events or complaints occurred in overseas, which is not approved products in the United States, what guidance documents we should follow, or if there is any restriction to bring the product back to the United States for the evaluation or analysis. So 3 parts of questions.
I'll try my best. So the first part was about GLP and non-GLP. And I would say that for early stage sort of clinical trials for, let's say, the EFS, IDE, and potentially even IDEs, like pivotal IDEs, FDA does consider non-GLP, but it has to have independent quality oversight of the data. So while you might not be in compliance with every single clause in the GLP regulation, there still is the expectation that you're going to have somebody from a quality assurance or standpoint reviewing the outcomes of those reports and making sure that the summaries are accurate and the data is whether they need to know that they're getting real chicken, essentially, right? Like FDA, that's their big concern. And so it helps them have confidence in that data and that they're receiving conclusions that are accurate representations of what happened in the study. But for marketing applications, I would say, we always would do a GLP. They've been pretty clear on that. The other thing you had a question about was OUS studies and how FDA views that. And they're far more open to leveraging OUS data than they were years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I think it's commonplace now for them to see in an application data from Australia or Western Europe or even Eastern Europe. So I don't see that as a showstopper. In the past, maybe it has been. If you have complaint data, OUS, I think the governing guidance would be FDA's guidance on foreign clinical data. If you just Google foreign clinical data and FDA guidance, it should pop up. But they have some expectations for what to do in that case. And then shipping back devices, if they're just for investigation, if they're just for understanding what happened, they're not going to be used in a clinical trial in the US. You wouldn't have to have an IDE approved to ship those devices back through customs. But if they are going to be used, if you're shipping capital equipment back or some other piece that's going to be then intended for US patients, then you would need a investigational device exemption prior to doing that. Does that help?
Yeah, but those devices, a feasibility study, we don't have, if we do not have IDE study yet.
Sure.
And therefore, what to follow. FDA guidance documents say, have to provide the IDE number, but don't have that. And so if that's the case.
If it's just to evaluate the devices, what happened, OUS, and maybe try to do a postmortem on the device itself to find out if it was a device failure of some sort, then you don't need an IDE to do that. But you need an IDE if you intend, again, to use the components in US patients kind of after they get into the US and distribute those to sites.
So basically the labeling becomes a non-human use and ship it back.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep. Yeah. This will be probably the last question, I'm guessing, and then we'll take our break, and then we'll start with Mr. Pohl's presentation here at 11. Go ahead.
So I want to go back to where you talk about accelerating approval process. And I wanted to know when you're making sure that you have covered all the guidance documents before meeting with FDA, what kind of tools would you suggest other than the FDA website that would be helpful in making sure we have covered all the guidance that apply to the medical device we're working on?
Yeah, so the question is about how to landscape FDA guidance documents that might be relevant to your device, and it's a really good question. And I'll just tell you what I do is I'll search not only on FDA's website for the guidance on their guidance document page, for keywords related to my device, but I'll go to the 510K summaries or the summary of safety and effectiveness data from PMAs that are most closely related to my device, which have functionality or claims which are very similar. And then those summaries will oftentimes list what standards and which guidances were followed. Not all of them do, but if you take a sample of those, you should get a couple of hits on, directionally, what are the things that I need to be doing from a guidance document perspective. And that's the best way that I've come across doing it. Yeah, that's what I do. Okay. Thanks everybody for your time and attention.